So as we just saw in the last mini lecture, the systematic segregation of African Americans in public life wasn't a product of the immediate post-Civil War period. It was something that didn't take full effect until later in the 1890s. And so when we find African Americans in baseball and in some other sports in the post-Civil War period, in some places we find African American participation and African American integration into the world of sport. Not always in large numbers, but nevertheless in ways that after the 1890s had become largely impossible. For example, there were many northern African Americans in cities after the Civil War who began forming baseball teams much as white Americans had begun doing in the 1840s and 1850s. And we find that African American baseball teams were frequently made up of people who were forming teams for many of the same reasons that whites had before the Civil War. Not just to participate in sport that they enjoyed playing, but for the purposes of public joining. This is Octavius Catto, who was one of the leaders of the primary black baseball team in Philadelphia in the 1860s and 70s called the Philadelphia Pythians. And Pythian membership was made up of the same kinds of individuals that had been tended to join baseball teams in the 1850s and 60s. It tended to be people who economically were middle class, skilled workers, teachers, urban professionals, people of this nature. Except that in the context of the free black middle class in northern cities, these African Americans were among the black elite. And so you find African Americans joining baseball teams for the same kind of statement about public joining, public citizenship, and public identity that we discussed a little bit when we talked about baseball in New York before the Civil War. And remember that questions about integration and segregation in public life continued to be issues of debate in the 1860s and 1870s. And these debates didn't just take place in the South. And so Octavius Catto, in addition to being one of the leaders of the Philadelphia Pythians Baseball Club, was involved in Republican Party politics in Philadelphia in the 1860s and 1870s. And he had been among the African American leaders in Philadelphia that began protesting the kinds of discrimination you might find in northern cities as well as in the former Confederacy. For example, Catto protested the segregation of streetcars in Philadelphia. In fact, in 1871, Catto was murdered on Election Day by a white Democrat for having voted, which was the kind of election violence that you might encounter not just in the former Confederacy in the 1860s and 1870s, but elsewhere in the country. The Pythians, as a baseball team, were occasionally able to play not just other black baseball teams in Philadelphia and New York and some other cities, but did occasionally play white baseball teams in the Philadelphia area. And as we talked a little bit about in the previous lecture, there was a kind of interim period in race relations in the 1860s and 70s, where there was a large amount of discrimination in a variety of ways, and a great deal of violence with respect to race in public life in a variety of ways. But you nevertheless occasionally find examples of integration in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s that would later become legally impossible in a variety of ways. To give you another example from the world of baseball, Moses Fleetwood Walker in 1884 became the first African American to play baseball in what was considered at the time a major league. And he was one of a small number of black players that played on predominantly white teams in organized baseball in the 1880s. Beginning in the 1880s, you began to see a differentiation between what were considered the two major leagues, the National League and the American Association, and so-called minor leagues in smaller cities that began springing up elsewhere in the country. Moses Fleetwood Walker had played college baseball at Oberlin College. Here he is with his brother Welde Walker at Oberlin College. He'd played baseball at Oberlin College. He played baseball for a year at the University of Michigan. And you do find occasional black baseball and football players at a handful of northern colleges throughout the late 19th century, Oberlin, Michigan, Harvard, and a few others. And in 1883, he played on the predominantly white Toledo Blue Stockings in what was at the time a minor league. But in 1884, there was a trade war in Major League Baseball. There was an upstart league called the Union Association that tried to establish itself as a league on par with the National League and the American Association. One of the things this led to was a trade war in Major League Baseball where the American Association and National League responded by expanding their leagues to add more teams. And so in 1884, there were dozens of teams playing in one of the three leagues that baseball historians have subsequently decided should be considered major leagues. And Moses Fleetwood Walker played on the Toledo Blue Stockings in the American Association in 1884 on this basis. It would be going too far to call baseball integrated in the 1880s because there were a very, very small number of black players that played on predominantly white teams in this period. And Walker appears to have been the only one to have played a significant number of games in the major leagues. His brother Wellday also appeared in a game or two for Toledo in 1884. But as we talked about in the last lecture, white Americans began drawing the color line, and that was an active choice. And the white baseball player generally talked about as having been prominent in the 1880s in his negative views with respect to African Americans playing against whites in baseball was Cap Anson, who was the star of the Chicago White Stockings and among the top hitters of the day. Anson had once tried to refuse to play against the Toledo Blue Stockings in an exhibition game in 1883 because they wanted to play Walker. When he was informed that the Blue Stockings would be happy to accept Chicago's forfeit and take all the money, he decided against it. But later in the 1880s, Anson, when encountering the opportunity to play against a black player in an exhibition or in some other kind of a context, it wasn't uncommon, even for Major League Baseball teams, to try to make extra money by playing exhibitions against other teams, against college teams, against minor league teams, and so on. And Anson was far from the only white baseball player in the 1880s who began refusing to play against black players in any context. And it wasn't until 1890 that African Americans completely disappear from all levels of organized baseball, major and minor. Among the other black players that played occasionally on predominantly white teams in the 1880s were Bud Fowler, who was a second baseman, and George Washington Stovey, who was a pitcher. And they also played on predominantly white teams occasionally in minor leagues in the 1880s. But by 1890, in organized baseball, the color line had been successfully drawn by white supremacists. And after that, when you look for African Americans in professional or semi-professional baseball, you find them only on all black teams. Some of these teams were able to have a professional or at least a semi-professional existence by barnstorming and by touring and by playing not only other black teams, but it was occasionally possible, even after 1890, for an all-black team occasionally to play an all-white team in a barnstorming situation. Not very often, but that was something that would occasionally occur. But a team made up of a mix of black and white players in organized baseball does not happen from 1890 until Jackie Robinson in the 1940s. Among the most successful professional black teams in the 1890s were the New York Cuban Giants and Gorhams, a team in Chicago called the Chicago Unions. This picture is a picture of the Page Fence Giants. And the Page Fence Giants were called that because they were sponsored by a company in Michigan that made fencing. And the Page Fence Giants were sponsored as an advertisement for the Page Fence Corporation. And this kind of professional or semi-professional entrepreneurship continued to exist in African American baseball after 1890. But it's not a coincidence that it's in 1890, but not really until 1890, that the color line was completely and successfully drawn by white supremacists in organized baseball. In the 1860s and 70s, whites tried to draw that line, and sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. In boxing, the heavyweight champion in the 1880s, John L. Sullivan, also drew the color line and refused to fight African American fighters. And when whites are doing that in the 1870s and 1880s, they are drawing it at the time. They are making a choice, not just acquiescing in something that has always been. But by 1890, organized professional baseball was segregated by race in a way that did not begin to unravel until the 1940s.